All right, so welcome back everyone to Hello World. Last week we kind of had a workshop with Chris that was kind of an exception to our usual programming. We did some debugging and some other interesting stuff, but this week we're going to be building a weather web app. Very simple. I demoed it a little bit before I started recording here. And we're gonna build that completely from scratch. And even if you don't have any experience, you should be able to get along with this. The only things you will need are a text editor and a browser. It also would be nice to have Git so you can download the source if you want to take a look at that, but that is not a requirement. If you don't have any of those things, we do have a video up if you're watching from YouTube. Our Essential Tools workshop from last semester that will explain, goes into depth for about 2 hours on how to get all these things installed. So you should be good there. If you are a newcomer to Hello World, that's totally fine. If you've never programmed, let me know so that I can know to explain things like if statements, variables. But if you're already programmed and you're just trying to learn web development in particular, then I'll take a little bit faster pace. Again, if you've done like something like Intro to C, you're definitely going to be fine here. If you've never programmed before, don't worry, I will try to make sure I explain everything. And I said this before, all of our workshops are up on YouTube. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at what we're actually going to be building today. So if you head to that URL, github.com/rob-3/weatherapp, you'll be able to see this is actually the finished product. I finished it. I made some final tweaks about 2 hours ago and put this together. So if you want to have the final product and sort of see, sort of be able to see where we're going to end up, then you can go ahead and download this. So you can either use Git or you can just download a zip. If you go to this little code button, click zip. If you want to go ahead and build it along, we're going to start from a template I built actually. So if you want to go to this URL, I'll put it in the chat so you guys can. When you type a city, it says request failed. Let's do the same in your system. No, it does not. I shouldn't do that. So we'll see. We can get around to seeing and debugging some things. Oh, come on. For some reason, chat isn't working for me. If I close it. Just to reiterate, yes. Okay, so there's a question. We need text editor and what else? You need a text editor and a web browser. So if you're on Windows, you've never done any programming before, you could always use Notepad. It doesn't have any syntax highlighting. A lot of people like Visual Studio Code. That's what I usually recommend. I'm going to be using Vim today because that's my favorite text editor, but it doesn't really matter too much. What you need to do first, though, is go to this URL. So I put it in the chat. For everyone on YouTube, you can head over to github.com/rob-3/html-css-js-template. And then if you head here to code and hit download zip, you will get a zip file, which you want to then extract. So you just download that somewhere. I'm on Mac, but it should be a very similar process for anyone on Windows. So you can go ahead and extract that. I actually am going to be using Git, so you can also just download it with Git clone if you know how to do that. If not, don't worry about it. You can just do it that way. All right, and then you're going to want to fire up whatever editor you're using and open up that directory. Okay, so yours might be called HTML, CSS, JS template. If you just rename the file or go into that, you'll have this kind of basic template going. The first thing I want to take a look at is index.html. So in case you're not aware, a basic website, this is sort of review from last semester, so anyone who's from last semester, you can sort of tune out for a minute. A basic website is essentially just a collection of text files. So the one that will get immediately opened is the HTML file. So if you go to a page, if you've browsed the web before, you've probably gone to an HTML file. You see that .html in your URL bar. Sometimes some browsers will hide it to make it less confusing, but ultimately it is an HTML file. And that describes the structure of your page. So that's going to show like, okay, what actually shows up on the screen. So you've got a few main parts. First, you have this kind of doc type HTML at the top here. That's just, again, a lot of this is boilerplate. You just need to have it in every HTML document. You don't need to worry about it too much. Then you have, what you have is a series of tags. So you start with this HTML tag. The way every tag works, or most tags work, is they open and close. So it opens, we see we have HTML, and then we have these angle brackets here to connect it. And then all the way here at the end of the file, we have the close HTML. So most tags work like this. There are a few that are self-closing, so you don't need to do this, but most of them you have to open it and then close it. The only real difference is the closing is going to have this slash in front. So your whole HTML document needs to be inside this HTML tag. The next thing you have is a head. So your head, this stands for header. This usually contains meta information. So it's not anything that's actually going to show up on the screen. You've basically just got, it's some information about the document itself that the browser needs to know in order to know how to display it. So for example, it's important to set your character set to UTF-8. If you were in China, for example, or you need some characters that weren't included in UTF-8, then you might change that to something else. But most of the time, that's going to be what you want to use. It has all the common characters. You can set the title. So this title tag, right? So we open here and close here. You don't have to do it over multiple lines like these other ones. Sometimes you can just do it in one line like this. This is going to contain what the tab is called. So we'll see that in a minute when we open this up in the browser. And then, so I just have my title, but we'll probably be changing that. And right here, you have a CSS style sheet. So if you want to, CSS is a language, it stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's a language to add formatting. So you can use it for animations and transitions. Basically, I like to think of CSS as just spicing up your whole application, making it look pretty. It's not necessarily strictly necessary to make something that works, but it does make it look a lot nicer. So if you want to link in a style sheet, this is how you do it. And we'll go over kind of some of the components of this and exactly what all this stuff does. And then we have script. JavaScript is increasingly an important part of modern applications. This gives your page interactivity. So if you just have like a static site, like you might have a portfolio website where you just kind of maybe display some pictures of yourself, have your resume as a PDF, some things like that. If you just have a static site where nothing really changes on it or infrequently changes, you don't need to interact with the user. You just need to display some information. Or you want to do like a blog, for example, and just you post articles from time to time, but like the user doesn't really interact with the page. Then you probably don't need very much JavaScript. You mostly can get away with HTML and CSS. JavaScript lets you have buttons that when you click them, they do things, or it allows you to interact with APIs and have interactivity to your page. So it's for web applications versus like web pages, it's very important. So this is just how you include a script file. That's the end of our header. So none of this stuff is getting displayed. Remember, we're just telling the browser, hey, we have here's our characters that we want to use, here's our title, here's our styles we want to use, and here's some script we want to include. And that's all meta information. And now we're getting down here into the body. So the body contains what's actually going to go on the page. Right here, all we have on this page is a paragraph. So if you use P, that stands for paragraph, and that makes you a paragraph that has the text inside of it. So we're going to see hello world from HTML when we open this up in our browser. Then here, you might see this all grayed out. That's because this is a comment. So this is an HTML comment. It's just the way you do that is it's a tag, but you do exclamation point, hyphen, hyphen. And then if you look at the very bottom there, you close it with hyphen, hyphen, and the other angle bracket. So this is a comment. So none of this stuff will show up. This is just like comments you might have in other languages. The computer doesn't interpret this at all. I just put this here so you can see a lot of the different other tags that you might want to use sometimes, but it's not really super important. So I'm just going to delete it for now. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Let's actually, there are a few other things, the other two files we're going to look at, but let's actually open this up and see what it looks like. So if you want to actually open up a local page, right? I told you that web pages are just an HTML document. So the way you want to open it up is just go Control-O or Command-O, if you're on Mac. And then you want to navigate to the directory. So in this case, I have it weather app. So go through your file manager, find the directory, and then you want to open the HTML file. So if you open that up, then you'll get a web page. And so you can see this is not a very impressive web page, right? Pretty empty. There's our hello world from HTML. Right, so if we go back to our editor here, we can see, okay, that's showing up, right? Also, if you notice, so we have my title. That is our title of our tab. So see how our tab is called my title? If we change that to something else, so I don't know, a different title. All right, save that file, go back to our browser. Then it doesn't change immediately. So in order for it to register the new changes, you're always going to have to reload. But now you can see it says different title. So that's how you can change that title there. Very simple. Okay, so that's our basic index.html. Now you might wonder, okay, why is this red? Well, that's CSS, right? So remember, CSS is mostly for formatting, making things look pretty. So if we want to go and open up styles.css, you can see a very empty styles file. This right here is just saying, make all paragraphs to have the color red. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of different CSS properties and amazing things you can do with CSS. I'm honestly not that experienced with it. And that'll probably be the last thing we add to our app because it's not really super important for the functionality. We're going to be doing a more in-depth workshop on CSS as well in the future here. So that's our styles file. And then we also have our script.js. So this is our JavaScript file. We can see we have a console.log and then hello world from JavaScript. So this is very similar to other classical programming languages. So if you've used, like, I know we had some people say they're using Java, Python, or C before. If you're used to those languages, HTML and CSS are more declarative. They're not really like a real programming language, some would say. JavaScript is a real programming language. So it has your things, all your if statements, it has variables. And basically the way you print something out in JavaScript is console.log. So you might be wondering, okay, so we console.logged, where is that actually showing up? It doesn't show up to the page, right? It doesn't. Where it does show up is to your developer console. So console.log is usually not used for interacting with the user. It's more of a way to debug your page and kind of see what the value of things are at different points. It's not really like a primary method of interacting with the page. So if you head over to your settings and go to web developer and see, I believe it is, yes, toggle tools. It might be slightly different in Chrome. So I'm using Firefox here. If you're using Chrome or Safari or Microsoft Edge or some other browser, it should also have some kind of developer tools. There's also usually a keyboard shortcut that does it, but I think it's different for different browsers. But probably somewhere over here, you're going to be looking for, more options or web, and it should be some option for web developer tools. You should get something that looks something like this. And this lets you see, so you can see there's a whole bunch of different things you can look at after you want to check the performance of your application or how much memory it's using up or network request. You can do all that, but console is what we're going to be mostly looking at. And let me see if I can blow this up a little bit. Actually, it's kind of small. Oh, it doesn't make this bigger. Okay. But you can see our hello world from JavaScript is getting printed there. And it tells us it came from script.js line 1. So that's where our things show up. Usually we use that for debugging. But yes, so that's the console. All right, so let's take a look at what we actually need to do in order to get this application working. So let's go back to the working one. Okay, so you can see there's some CSS done here. But basically, the way this would work is you type in a city. So for example, New York. You can hit enter or you can hit the button, and then it will grab some data from an API about the weather, current weather in New York. There's a lot more data than this, but this is just what I'm displaying. So apparently it's pretty miserable there right now. Sleet, 39 degrees, high, 31 low, pretty bad. So there's a few different things that we're going to need to do. First, usually the first thing I do for an application is try to mock up what the UI is going to look like. So there's basically 4 parts to this UI. First, you have these instructions, sort of type a city to get the current weather, right? This can probably just be a paragraph. you have this text box. This is an input element, and I'll show you what that looks like in HTML. This is a button element. You can click it, right? So yeah, in this case, it searched for nothing, so it failed, of course. And then we have this text down here that is the where we're getting the output for what happened. And this can just be another paragraph. So let's go back to our code here. Oh, let me reopen. So you can go back to your app if you are following along here. Okay, so we're going to go into index8.html. Now we don't need this. So let's go ahead. First, let's actually go ahead and set our title to like weather app or something. All right, so we've got that. Head down to our paragraph here. So we want to have in our paragraph instructions to the user. So say, we want to go ahead and say, what did we say? Type a city to get the current weather. Okay, so let's put that there. And of course you can put whatever you want, but that's what I'm gonna put. Okay, awesome. So we now have that. That's pretty easy. The other things we need are, we need this input. So in order to actually get an input like this, what you need to do is use an input element. So it's pretty simple to do. HTML is a pretty simple language overall. So you just need an input tag. And I believe the input it's one of the self-closing ones. Usually you also have to specify a type. So because there's different kinds of input you can do, right? So one option might be like you can do bullet. If you've seen like on a form before, you have different options, you know, like so you could have A, B, C, D sort of thing where you select one of those. But we just want like a text field. And the way to get that is to do type equals text. So these are called properties or attributes. And in HTML, you include them inside the open tag, but not inside the close tag. So we close our input here. So we include that inside the open, but not the close. And they usually take the form of some word equals some value. So that's how it knows that it's going to be text. Great. And then if we want to like pre-include something inside there, we can put stuff inside this tag, but I think we just want it to be blank at the beginning. So we just leave it like that. So let's go ahead and save that and head back to our browser and see. Okay, so it's kind of hard to see here because of the contrast, but hopefully you can see here we now have a text box we can type into. Oh, we also probably should fix the CSS to making it red, but we can do that at the end. Not a big deal. Okay, next thing we need is a button. So the way to do that is it's just a button element. You also need to set type equals button. Why you need to do this, there's a lot of, so the thing about web development is the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript have all been like evolving for a long time, right? If you remember websites many years ago, right, they weren't as impressive. So they've added new things to these languages to make it easier to use. But as a result, there's a lot of backwards compatibility that we need to do to make sure that old websites that still do things the old way still work. And so that's why you have to do weird things like this sometimes where you're like, oh, it's a button. Of course, its type is going to be button, but there are actually other kinds of buttons. So that's why you have to do it this particular way. And it's annoying, but sometimes that's what you have to do. Okay, so we have that. That's great. And then we also will need a kind of invisible paragraph that we can insert text into later. So for now, it's just kind of going to be a set of empty tags. There's nothing. It's not going to really show up. But later we will need that in order to insert the text that we get from our API. And this is basically all the stuff we need. One thing that you generally should do is, well, there's two ways you can do this. So if your browser is new enough, you can add the defer attribute to a script. That'll make sure the script doesn't run until after the whole body has been loaded in, which can be important for what we're going to do. The other thing you can do that works in new and old browsers, and so it's generally kind of the more standard way, at least until there's good support for defer, is to just put script here at the bottom of your body. It's still not going to show up as anything, but that'll make sure it's loaded last. So go ahead and move that down there. So let's head back to our browser and see, okay. Oh, our button didn't show up. And the reason our button didn't show up is because we didn't put any text for the button. So by default, it's just going to create, it's not going to actually create anything unless you put some text for the button. So I'm going to put click me on the button. So now we should get, yep. So now we get a button. We can click it. Yay. It might look a little different on your system too. Different operating systems or browsers might render this all a little bit differently. But it should look something like this. You have that. And then of course there's an invisible paragraph we can't see here. Oh. If you actually go to your developer tools, you can see it. So if you go to this inspector here, if you've ever seen someone do like right click, inspect element or whatever, that's just opening up your developer tools. And you can see, okay, it is here. We have our paragraph. There's just nothing inside it. So there's nothing to see. All right. So we've got, and that's basically all the HTML we need to write. We're going to be adding a few minor changes to it as we go on, but that's the bulk of the HTML we need to write today. Most of our application is going to be in JavaScript. So let's go ahead and open up script.js. If you're not familiar with JavaScript, you may confuse it with Java, for example. They are not the same. They have a lot of really important differences. Actually, the reason JavaScript is called JavaScript is because they kind of wanted to cash in on all of the marketing that was being done for Java at the time. So actually, they ended up getting sued for this, and they had to change the name. And so it's technically called ECMAScript, but most people still call it JavaScript. But it's not like Java. The case in point is that it's not like Java. There are some similarities, but a lot of things that are different. We don't really want to keep printing this out, so we can go ahead and delete that line. In order to, our JavaScript, what we need to do is we need to wire up our button, because right now, when we click the button, it doesn't actually do anything, right? So HTML is all about the structure of the document. It's the appearance. It's how it looks, how it shows up on the page. But it doesn't really give you behavior. So clicking the button doesn't do anything. We can type stuff. We can click the button, but this doesn't actually make anything happen. So JavaScript, we need to wire up these elements on the page, or these DOM nodes is what they're called, in order to actually get our program to do what we want. In order to do that, we first need to have a way to get a reference to those. So we need some way to access our HTML over here from our JavaScript. And the way to do that is to use a function called query selector. So first, let's grab our button. Okay, so there's a few things you want to see here. So when you declare a variable in JavaScript, there's two ways you can do it. You can use let, or you can use const. Let allows you to reassign it later. So basically, you can later go do this, right? If you have const, this won't work. So if we do this, this will throw an error in JavaScript, because when we try to assign a to 4, it will say, no, it can't do that. Generally, good practice is to always use const unless you need to use let. So all this is a variable declaration. So we're creating a button, and that button is going to be, in order to connect this button to the one that's on the screen in HTML, we use this document.querySelector function. So if you haven't seen a function call before, I think most of you said you had experience with programming. So, but this, you do a function call, you have these parentheses, and then you pass in, what are we passing in here? So this is actually the ID of the element we want to get. So this is really the only thing we have left to add to our HTML. So we need to set, in order to access our HTML elements from JavaScript, we need to add an ID. So to our button, it's just like type, it's another attribute. So ID, let's make our button's ID button. Or let's make it something else so it maybe is a little more clear. I don't know, clicky thing. Okay, so you need to put a hash in front of it whenever you use an ID, because there's also other ways to select. So you can select like more than one element, like all the elements that are of a certain type or something, and those have different characters. So this hash is for ID. So great. We now have access to our button. Make sure you save both those files. We also are going to need access to this input element, because how are we going to read the text out of it? Well, we need access to it. So I'll call that input. We're going to do basically the exact same thing. And what do we want to call the input? I'm going to call it text box. But you can call it whatever you like. So again, we need to add an ID for input. You don't have to do these attributes in any particular order, by the way. If you want to put that first, it's fine. Just make sure you separate them with a space, and HTML will be happy. So great, we have our button, we have our input. The other thing we're going to need is we're going to need some kind of handle to this empty paragraph here. So I'm going to call this output. All right, so now this button right here. So this button variable here is a direct way to access our button. Our input is a way to get our input. Our output is a way to get our output. We have all those things. That's good. Let's first play around with the button, because if you're used to other languages but not JavaScript, some of the ways in which JavaScript works are probably going to be a little confusing to you. So most of the time in JavaScript, you're going to be using what's called an event-based architecture. So your standard like C program or Python program, probably what you do is you start reading on line 1. So your program starts executing from top to bottom. And once it gets to the bottom or the bottom of the main function, you might have some function calls and you jump around a bit, right? But eventually your program's just running all this code and then it comes to a halt. JavaScript works a little bit differently. Because if you try to think about what code you would need to handle a button click, for example, right? So what kind of thing might you want to use in order to basically, because as long as the web page is open, you need to keep running. You can't ever stop running. So you probably have like some loop. And then every time you go around the loop, you might need to check like, okay, has the button been clicked? Has the button been clicked? And this is actually how JavaScript ends up working under the hood, because JavaScript is written in C++, and that is what's happening. But to make it more convenient for the user, it uses this event-based architecture that gives you kind of a different way of thinking about this problem. Instead of constantly checking to see, has the button been clicked, or has this happened, or has that happened, you can do what's called registering an event listener. So an event listener waits for a certain thing to happen, and then it will call a function for you. So first, let's make a function. To make a function in JavaScript, you just write function, and then whatever you want the function to be called. So I'm going to call this onClick, because I want it to happen every time we click, but you can call it whatever you want. And then when we click, let's just print out to the console button clicked. Okay, so this is going to be similar to like C style functions or Java style functions. One thing to notice about JavaScript is that there's no type, so you don't need to do like string or something to show that you're sending back a string, or int to show you're sending back an int, or void. There's no types, you don't need to do that. So we have this onClick function that says button clicked. Great. In order to actually set it up so that this function will be called whenever the button is clicked, we need to attach it to the button. So the way you do that is button.add event listener. And add event listener is a function that takes in two things. First, what event to listen to. So we're going to listen to click events. And then what function should we call when that happens? So onClick. And notice we don't want to actually call onClick, right? We just want to say, okay, without the parentheses to show that we're not calling it, we're saying when there's a click, we want JavaScript to call this function for us. So this sort of programming might seem a little strange if you're not used to it, but it is the dominant way that UI code is written, because having that interactivity, you need to be able to wait and say, okay, wait until this happens. If and when this happens, do this. And having this event listener, event-based sort of architecture is what makes it easy to do that. So let's save all those files and actually test this out. So reload, open up our browser console, right? And if we click the button, you now see, look, button clicked. And if you click it more times, It should keep doing it. The reason it might seem like it's not is over here. If you see this number, the log, instead of having a bunch of entries to just spam it, it will just increment this number to show it's been printed that many times. If you get different things printed, it won't do that. So yeah, you can click this, it will keep printing it. Great. Okay. So now we know how to wire our button up. Now this isn't really what we want to do ultimately. So we need to add code to do the right thing. But we now sort of know how a button works. Basically, our whole application is going to hinge on this button, right? Because when we load up the page, is there anything else that we really need to do before that button gets clicked? Not really. So let's think about the process of what we need to do in order to actually get the weather data. So first, all right, what's the first thing the user should do? They should type in a place like New York, and then they should click the button. And that should trigger this whole chain of events where, okay, we're going to read the New York out of the text box. We're going to take that and we're going to somehow look up New York. And I'm going to show you the API we're going to use. It's very simple to use and how to use that. And then we're going to finally display that onto the screen. So let's start with the very first thing. First, the user types in the box and then they click the button. So when they click the button, let's go ahead and get rid of this. What we actually want to do is first read out of the text box, read that value out. So let's see, I'm just going to make a variable called user input. And in order to read what's currently in the text box, you just use remember our text box handle is called input. And then you just do value. So I'm going to say, okay, we make a variable called user input, and then copy whatever's in input.value that represents what's inside of that text box currently, get that. And to prove you this works, let's log out user input so we can see if that works. So let's reload the page, open up our log. All right, so if we click this, look, it says New York, and let's change it to something else. Let's change it to Orlando, right? Click that, it says Orlando. Okay, great. So it's successfully reading out. We now have that. So once we have this city, how do we actually translate this into weather data? Well, you could, if you had like basically we're going to use someone else's weather data, because I don't just have like a magical machine that has all this weather data on it. A lot of times you want to do something like this because there's no reason to reinvent what already exists. So if you let's go ahead and head over to metaweather.com. Let me blow this up a little so you can see it a little better. So this is a website that has a free weather API. There are many APIs that are free. Some APIs you have to pay for. So depending on your project, you might want to do that or might not. But many APIs are free. It's pretty simple to use. There's only kind of one snag with it. I'll show you in a minute. You can actually just view the weather here. But basically, in order to view the API documentation, we want to go to this API. Okay, so let's kind of read what it says here. MetaWeather provides an API that delivers JSON over HTTPS for access to our data. Drop an email. Okay, so that is one thing. The API is a little bit slow. It's probably why it's free. So if you like spam requests, it might get kind of laggy, but it should be fine. If you kind of read the docs, you can see what we need to do. So first, a location search. This is what we want to do. So it gives us this URL. So we have /API/location/search/?query equals query. So you can see kind of some examples here. So if you query equals San, then it will look up cities that start with San. If you do query equals London, it will look up things that start with London and give those back, presumably. And this slash is going to be on this page. So we're already at API. So this API is the same as that API. So if we want to actually kind of look at this data without doing anything in our code, you can actually just type the rest of that extension. So like here, let's do the London one. And you actually get the raw data back. So you can see, okay, we get London back. Let's do new, because there's lots of cities that start with new, right? So notice what the API does when you give it something that's kind of ambiguous. You get back a kind of a list, right? So you get a 0, 1, 2. This is basically an array is what this actually is. Because if you look at the raw data, right? Let's make it pretty. you can see this is inside of an array. So it gives us an array with New York, New Delhi, New Orleans, all these different cities that start with new. For our case, you could, in your application, like have like a drop down that shows the different options. In our case, we're just going to pluck the first one because we want to keep it simple. We don't have a lot of time. All right, so how do we actually interact with this API, right? So we know we need to go to a specific URL. The URL is this metaweather.com. So let's go ahead and copy this. Go back to our application. Kind of paste that in. And you got to put it in a string, okay? And also we can move this up here with our global variables because we might need to use it again. It's not necessarily just something for this one function. So we have, okay, this URL, and let's see, let's add all the query stuff we need to. So we need, let's go ahead and copy that as well. Well, that didn't work. Okay, there we go. All right, and then here's the thing though, we don't want to always do the same query, so we just leave it blank. And then we know that, okay, we need to read in the user's input and add it to the end of this URL for it to be the right URL. Okay, so is everyone good with that? We have this API. This is for some APIs you'll need to do, you need to like get an account sometimes or get an API key. Luckily, this one, it's very simple. You don't need an API key or anything like that in order to use it. So that makes it simpler. So down here, we're going to do a request. The way you do a network request is with the fetch function. So you just do fetch and then you do the URL you want to use. So in this case, we're going to do this current URL that we have here. But remember, we need to append whatever that input is from the user. Right? So to concatenate, if you're used to C, you might know string copy. If you're used to Java or Python, you just know regular plus. JavaScript is like that. You just need plus to concatenate strings together. So we just do this. And we fetch the URL and user input. And this is where, so things get a little bit strange here. If we want to maybe we want to log that out to see like what exactly are we getting, right? So we can see this is another thing that's going to be dependent on the event-based architecture. So if we do this, remember nothing happens until we click the button, right? Because that was all inside of that onClick function. So this function is just a definition. It doesn't actually get called until the click happens. So let's go ahead and click the button with Orlando and see, okay. So you see a few things. First, we see some errors. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But what is important is we have this promise pending. So the way JavaScript actually does network requests is in an asynchronous way. You can kind of think of it, a good sort of analogy would be like this. A phone call is synchronous, right? If I call you and we want to have a conversation, then we both need to be on the call at the same time. You could leave messages, but don't think about that for now, right? We both need to be on the call at the same time. I say something and you listen while I'm talking, and then I stop, and then you talk and I listen, right? So that would be a synchronous way to communicate. Asynchronous would be like an email or a text. I can send you a text and then go, do the laundry or make dinner or whatever, and then come back when I have time and read my text again. And same for you, right? I don't need to send a text and then sit and wait until you receive it. I can just send it, fire it off, and then leave and come back to it later when it's ready, when I get a notification, right? And notice how that's a lot more efficient, right? If you actually had to go and send an email and then wait for the person to reply, they may never reply. It could take a long time, could take days, could take weeks. They may never reply. Maybe your email never actually sent. And you have the same thing with network requests, right? If you reach out to a server, maybe the server's under heavy load and it takes a few minutes to get a request back, or maybe the server went down and it's actually never going to reply to your request. Well, we can't afford to just wait for it forever. So instead, you have to program in a slightly different way to account for this. Basically, so this is what the way this works is you get a promise object back. For those of you who were at some of our workshops from last semester, we did not talk about this. So we've kind of already discussed all this other stuff before, but promises are something new. A promise just represents a value that hasn't arrived yet. So basically when we call fetch, right? So let's say we were doing it the phone call way, which would be inefficient. If we do it the phone call way, we call fetch and we could say, you know, we have some result that we get back from fetch, right? But then we would have to wait for the server to reply. So then if we wanted to have, you know, more code, like we want to log something out, well, this code might never run. Because what if the server never gets back to us, right? So this is why we can't do asynchronous fetch, because then we would just be stuck on this, you know, line 12 here forever, potentially, depending on what the server does, which is not a situation you want to get into. So what you do instead is, instead of trying to store a value from fetch, you get back a promise. And a promise is an object that will later resolve to a value. In order to actually get the value out of it, you use this .then function. Oh, we have a question in the chat. So someone in the chat says, the console says that onClick is not defined, but I have the same code. Interesting. Are you certain that you have function onClick written in your JavaScript file? And also, have you saved? That's another thing. Actually, I changed the name of onClick and it works. Oh, interesting. That is kind of interesting. Yeah, well, it should change it to please work. Yeah. Yeah, you can call it something else. Usually, you call it something like handler. So maybe that. It should work. It should work regardless of what name you choose. But yeah, I'm glad you're able to figure it out. Okay. Yeah. So I actually usually use handler because I'm handling the event, right? So when the click happens, how do we handle it? We use handler. Okay, so back to our promise. So the way our promise works is we can do a .then chained onto it. And .then takes in another function. That is what gets a function that gets called when if and when this fetch returns, when we get data back from the server. So let's define another function. So we can call it like when data returns or something. And then we can do data. Oh, one thing we do need to do though. So actually when we get data back, we actually don't get data back the first time. We just get a blob of data that doesn't have any specific format to it, right? Because when we do this fetch, like it could be text, it could be an image, you know, it could be a video, there could be any number of things to this fetches. So the first thing you need to do is write a function that will return back the right type. So you take this blob of data, and in this case, remember the site said we're using JSON, so you do blob.json and return that back. And so then we can put when data runs here. These thens can sometimes get pretty long, so I'm going to start breaking up over a few lines here. All right, and you can continue to chain more thens. So this is all stuff that we're going to say, okay, none of this immediately happens, but if and when this fetch gives us back some data, do these things. So first, we do this blob to blob.json. So we know now we have our JSON. So now we have our actual data. And let's just take our actual data and just log it out. Does the then block? No. So that's why we're specifically doing this. So for those of you who aren't sure what he means by that. Blocking IO is probably what you're used to in most other languages. And this is why people grapple with JavaScript sometimes and have a lot of trouble with it. Because most languages like Python or C or Java, usually you learn how to get input by you start with like a command line program and you read an input. You use like scanf or something. And you're used to the program sitting there and just waiting for you to type something in, right? But in our case, we can't afford to wait for that to show up, because what if this fetch never shows up? Or what if the user never clicks the button? All of JavaScript runs, it's just like you. It can only do one thing at a time. Not a very good multitasker. It only does one thing at a time. So if we're waiting for data to show up, then we can't do anything else. So actually, there used to be blocking IO or blocking network requests in JavaScript. And what would happen is maybe you've seen this on an older site. You would click a button and it would need to do some network requests. And so the whole page would freeze and you wouldn't be able to do anything else. Like you click other things or try to type, right? And nothing would happen. You'd be like, okay, this isn't very good. Why is this happening? Well, because JavaScript can only do one thing. And at that time, it's waiting for it to show up. So they said, this is not good. We need to do this differently. So that's why they came up with this idea of a promise and a value that can show up later. And this way you can not block your JavaScript. So things can continue to run. You can still handle other button clicks. You can do other things while you're waiting for that data to show up. So yeah, then is non-blocking. That's why you do it this way. We'll get into more details on this. Next week, we're doing Node.js, and Node.js is built on top of all asynchronous non-blocking functions. I'll go into a lot more detail about some of the other syntaxes like async await, callbacks, different ways that async IO can be represented and why it's beneficial. But just for this week, if you have to, just kind of look at this and be like, okay, this .then stuff is kind of magic, but next week I'll go into a lot more depth on this. We just don't have time today. Okay, great. So we have this then. So we get the data, right? When the data returns, first we want to turn it into JSON. So we do blob.json. And then we want to log it out. So we need to say then. So then use got actual data. Our semicolon, always good practice. All right, let's try this. Oh, so we also have another problem. This cross origin request blocked. If your browser is up to date, you should get this problem. Basically, most people aren't running HTML files off of their computer. And so for the average user, they're probably doing something wrong with their security. And so the browser tries to protect you from yourself. Basically, what we need to do is set up add a proxy so that we can actually get information back from this API. Also, because this API, it's a good API, it has good data, but whoever configured it did not necessarily do so intending for us to use it, more so for servers to use it, not for a browser. So what we need is this. We need a proxy URL, which I will put into the chat. You need to add this line of code to your program. And this cores anywhere. So you might see the error had said something about cores. That stands for cross origin something. Basically, if you append it in front of a URL, then you'll stop getting this error. Again, not a lot of time to go in depth on this. You don't usually need to do this. And this is one reason why a lot of people use frameworks, because a framework can do this automatically for you, so you don't have to worry about this. But for now, we have to do it. So that's fine. I just define it and then say our URL is that plus the URL which we actually want. And if you do that, it should work now. So let's try it. Let's go back to our New York example. Okay, so that was pretty fast, right? So you can see our console.log happened, right? We printed out New York. So that was this line here. And then our fetch happened and it turned it into JSON. And then when we logged it out. So let's actually see what we got back. Okay, so this is the same thing that was, I wonder if I can make this bigger in some way. I don't know, but this is the same thing here, if you can see, that we got before when we actually just directly navigated to the page, which is good. So that means we're able to get the data back. Notice it always gives us back an array. So even if there's only one item, it'll still give us an array. So that's good. We were able to get the data. The next thing I want to show you is a more convenient syntax for doing this, because you can see if we do this, we're going to keep having to come up with these kind of annoying function names like when data returns and got actual data, right? This is kind of annoying. So JavaScript supports what's called an anonymous function. What that means is you can make a function without giving it a name. So instead of doing, because really, are we ever going to use this when data returns function again? Like we're not going to go, up here and say, hey, we just want to call this function. It's not like a function in that sense we would want to use. It's more of just sort of a one-shot thing we're going to do every time this specific thing happens. So to facilitate that kind of programming, you can actually just directly pass the function in here. So this syntax is definitely probably going to look kind of strange, but this is still the same. You can think of it as still the same dot then, right? So we have this dot then, and there's, you can see there's the end of the dot then, and you just put the function straight inside. And if you do this, you no longer have to name it, right? Because this function's already here. So this is called a function literal, or you might hear it called a lambda or an anonymous function. It's just a function that doesn't have a name. And this makes it more convenient because now, look, we don't need this got actual data. We can just go in here and say function, and we take data, and then we console.log it out. Okay, so if we try this, we should still get the same results. And we do. Great. And there's one more thing we can actually do, because so in the original versions of JavaScript, this was as succinct as it got. But really, people got tired of writing function all the time. So we can actually shorten this even more. So we can delete the function. And then if we put an arrow here, then it will know that it's a function. So you can do the same thing here. And this is we're getting closer to the most popular notation. There's a few more things you can do. So people got tired of putting these braces. If you only have one thing in your function, so sometimes you have multiple lines you want to do. So maybe, maybe we want to log the blob out before we return it. Then you can still do it this way. It's fine. Use the braces. You're all good. But a lot of times you just want to do one thing, right? We just want to use this blob.json. We don't really care about anything else. So you can delete the braces. You don't need a semicolon on the line. And you also can omit return. It will know, so it'll know, okay, basically now we're saying .then, anonymous function. We've taken that blob of data. And then the arrow without any braces means it will automatically return it for us. So we take that blob of data and call blob.json. And we can do the same thing here. Console.log doesn't return anything, so it doesn't really make a big difference, but it does make it a little bit shorter. Okay. If anyone's confused about that, what was the keyboard input for the arrow? Oh, yes. Okay. So my editor just, my font has like special characters to make this happen. But this is actually just an equal sign and a greater than. My font just, when those two are next to each other, it makes it look like an arrow. But it's just, there's no shortcut for it. It's just an equal sign and then a greater than, but they're right next to each other. Yeah. I mean, it looks like an arrow mostly without it, but I use JavaScript a lot. So I was like, hey, this font's pretty cool. It has this feature. Okay. So if you notice, it's okay. Still does the same thing. Great. So it still works. The last thing you'll see some people do is there's another rule for shortening because, the JavaScript people are really lazy. They don't want to type it all. If you have only one argument to your function, then you can drop the parentheses. And so this is the absolute minimum. Don't worry. There's nothing else. It doesn't get any shorter. But you can see that this is a lot better than what we had before, right? Where we had all these extra functions down here. A lot of code that doesn't really do very much, right? This gives us a much more succinct way to do what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to continue to use this notation because this is kind of the standard way to do it. You want to use these anonymous functions, short anonymous functions that makes it easier to read, more compact. Okay, so we had this. Now we don't actually really want to log out this data, right? When we get this, what do we need to do next? So let's think about what we've done so far. We've kind of built our UI, not really much CSS, but that's okay. They can type in, they can now click the button. We read in that data, we fetch to the API and get back an array of different things that could match. Now, there's different things you could do. Like you could try to output all the different ones, but that could be a lot. Or in this case, what I decide just to keep the implementation of this project simple is just grab the very first item out of the array. So let's stop logging the data. So let's say, so we're going to grab that very first item, which is a city, out of the array. So remember, data is our array, right? Because we just logged it out, we saw it was an array. And to grab our first element, you need to use the array syntax and 0. So JavaScript, 0 indexed arrays, just like most other programming languages. So we pull out that city. So now if we log out that city, notice now we get object. So we now have an object, not an array anymore. And inside of our object, you can see we have some different properties. So an object in JavaScript is very similar to an object in Java or Python or other languages. It's if you only know C, it's a lot like a C struct. It's just a container for more variables. So in this case, inside of our object, we have this lat long. You have a series of key value pairs, right? So you have lat long, that's our latitude and longitude inside of a string. Maybe not the best format, but that's what the API gives us. Location type, it's a city. Apparently there could be other things. I don't know. Maybe they have like metropolis or different size or something like that. Title, okay, New York. But what we really care about here is this WOEID, and it just seems like a random number. Well, if we go back to, let's close that. If we go back to here and see, what does WOEID stand for? It's an integer. Where on earth ID? Okay, so that makes a lot more sense, right? Basically, the way this API works is every city that they have, or they have regions, states, provinces, countries, and continents, every one of those they have has a where on earth ID that refers only to that thing. So, and if we keep track of that, we can actually, if you go down here, if we want to get specific location data, we can make a request to the API at /API/location, and then / whatever our WOEID is. So in this case, they show some examples. So this number is London, this number is San Francisco. And then we're going to get back all of this other data here, which is our actual weather data that we want to use. Right? You can see, well, actually, they give us a lot of other things too. They give us location type, sunrise, sunset, latitude, longitude. But this consolidated weather is what we're going to look at, because that gives us weather state, wind direction, min, max temp, all the information we actually want. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So what we need to do now is make another request to this API, because we're able to get this WO ID out of the city we have. So in order to access it, it works just like it does in C or any other language that has objects. You can just do WO ID. So I'm going to do that. So we grab that WO ID out. So now we have this integer, right? And we want to do another fetch because we need to go get some more data. So in this case, we're going to need another URL. So URL2. And the only difference here is instead of doing this search here, we just have location. So if you actually look at what they want us to do. So here's our location search that we did before, /API location search. But if we already have the WO ID, we can just do API location and then the WO ID. So we can just delete that search query. That's the only difference here. Make sure you do leave a / on the end. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So now let's use our URL2. And we just add our WO ID on the end there. And now remember, this fetch is not going to block for us, right? So we can't get our data. A lot of people try to get data back by doing this, but you can't do this. Instead, you have to tell fetch, okay, I know you're going to go away and go fetch by yourself. What do you want? We have to tell fetch, here's what we want you to do when that data eventually does show up, if it does. So .then, and again, we have our blob. So we got to do this blob to blob.json. And we can do another .then, and now we actually have our real weather data. Okay, so now, and after the second .then, another anonymous function here, we take that weather data, and now inside of these sets of brackets here, we have the data that we need. So let's actually just log that out first so we can see what that looks like. Okay, so here we have it. So it gives us back an object. And it gives us, you can see all the different things. So we have consolidated. So it actually, consolidated weather is itself an array that has more information inside it. So that's what we're mainly interested in. But you have some other things like sunrise, it gives you the time, sunset, time zone, other miscellaneous stuff. This consolidated weather is really what we care about. So really, we should probably rename this. This is like city data, right? And then weather data, the city data dot consolidated. Let's see, how did they do it? Okay, they did underscore. So consolidated weather. Okay, so now we've got that. We've got this consolidated weather pulled out here. Now, one question I did have when I was originally doing this, looking at this API, is why are we getting back multiple here? You can kind of see each one's an object. They have an ID. They have a weather state name, so sleet, and then heavy cloud, clear, clear, hail. Why are these different? And the answer is they're just different days of a forecast. So this API actually gives you back several days of forecast. So the first one in the array is, if you look, applicable date is today. The next one is tomorrow, and the day after that, or 2 is going to be in 2 days, right? So if we want to do like a whole weather forecast thing, we could with this API. But for this app, keeping it simple. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to print out the data for today. So all we need to do is pluck out the 0th element, or this first element here out of that array. So we actually want consolidated weather 0. And now let's log that out so we can look more carefully at what's inside weather data here. So reload. Okay, so object. All right, so we've got this object back here that's just our 1 day today. It shows when it's created. Okay, so it gives us all kinds of different weather information. We have humidity, ID is probably just something that the API uses to keep track of all this stuff. We have our max temp, we have our min temp, predictability, I guess that's how sure they are about it or something like that. We have lead temp, visibility, weather state abbreviation. So it looks like they give us a name. So currently must be sleeting in New York. But for short, SL is what that is. And wind direction. Okay, so we have all this information. For this app, to keep it simple, I just put the high and the low, so min temp and max temp. And then also I put the weather state name or whatever the current weather is. So let's look at doing that. So let's first grab all that into variables. So high temperature would be this weather data dot, and what is it stored under? It would be max temp. Okay, and then let's get our low temp as well. Min temp, I believe, right? Yeah, okay, min temp. And then also our current like weather state. And that is weather underscore state underscore name. Okay, so now we have those variables all stored into constants, so we can use them later. That's great. And let's go ahead and print those things out. So log our high temperature. Low temperature. And log the weather, the current weather state. All right, great. So it works. We do have one slight issue that we're going to have to deal with here is, well, one, sometimes these numbers are atrociously long. And 2, they're not actually the right temperature for New York. So our problem here is that this API, if you read the documentation more carefully, gives you all of the numbers back in Celsius. Right? If you actually go down here and read consolidated weather temperatures here. It says centigrade, right? It's giving us back in Celsius, which is not what we want. At least, I don't know. I don't read Celsius. Maybe you guys do. But I like Fahrenheit. That's what I'm used to. So we're going to have to probably convert that. But hey, we're able to pull the data consistently. That's good. We have all the information we need about that. The weather state is working fine. So let's actually do that thing next. So to convert, I actually don't necessarily have this memorized offhand, but what I would do is define a function for this, because we're going to have to do it twice, right? We're going to have to do it once here and once here. So anytime you're repeating a process you're doing the exact same thing, you probably should make a function. So I'm going to call it to Fahrenheit. And we take in a Celsius amount, and we want to give back Fahrenheit. So let's actually, how do you convert? Celsius to Fahrenheit formula. It's like 9/5 something, I believe. Okay, Celsius times 1.8 plus 32. So we just give that back. So Celsius times 1.8. All the math operators are the same as they are in C or other languages. Plus 32. And order of operations will do the right thing in this case, but it's never a bad idea to group just so it's more readable to people, because some people may not know what order it goes in. You don't want people to start guessing, because what if they're wrong? It can be really confusing. Okay, so let's actually just in general test out our Celsius. Like, I don't know, what's a known quantity? Like if we pass in 0 degrees Celsius, that should give us 32 back. So let's test that. Make sure it works. Oh, reference error. Celsius is not defined. That's not good. Oh, I called the function the wrong thing. Should be 2 Fahrenheit. Okay, try it again. Oh, 32. Okay, good. So it does seem to work. Great. So we have that function. So now what we can do is, to get our actual correct temperatures, we can, right? Because this weather data.max temps in Celsius. So if we convert it straight to Fahrenheit, then we should get it in Fahrenheit now. Do the same thing here for our low. And now down here, when we print it out, it should read us the right number, or at least closer. I don't know how accurate this API is. We can see in a minute. Okay, so high 39. It still has these decimals, which are kind of annoying, but we can fix that. And low 30. Is that close to what this says? Yeah, seems about right. Okay, great. So we have that. Why don't we go ahead, before we keep working on getting this formatted exactly right, we can deal with that if we still have time at the end. Let's get this actually displaying onto the screen, because right now, this log, right? If you never open this up, it just looks like this program doesn't do anything, right? So let's get that actually displaying to the screen. The way you do this, remember how we had this handle up here to our output, or that hidden paragraph no one can see? Well, we're going to use that. And we just set output.enterHTML. So output is actually an object. So all of these things are objects. Anytime we're using this dot, it's an object. If you've done Java or object-oriented programming, that probably makes a lot of sense. But if you haven't, an object is just a way to collect different variables into one big variable. So in order, like, passing around all these different variables would be difficult. But if you kind of bundle them together into one object, then it makes it a lot shorter and easier to pass around. There are other advantages too. But again, objects is not necessarily the focus today. They're just a tool that we use. So output.enterHTML is a way to take that empty paragraph and inject arbitrary HTML that we want into it. So we could just put, some random thing like hello, or everything worked. And so let's actually see what that does. So we click it. Oh, everything worked. Okay, boom, there it is. But you don't just have to do literals. It can also be variables. So in this case, we're going to put all this stuff in. One thing you have to be careful about, though, is it is HTML. So you're actually going to be writing HTML inside of here. So what I'm going to do, so let's do our hi. And then one thing about HTML, in order to create a new line in HTML, so if you've used other languages, you probably tried to do like this before. HTML, though, remember, is what we're writing into this file. If we add more lines here, HTML doesn't care because it's not like more white space matters to it. To actually make a new line in HTML, you do this self-closing BR or line break tag, stands for break. So that's how HTML knows that, okay, this isn't just white space for your code. This is actually white space you want to see on the screen. So what we'll need to do is put that inside of at the end of our sort of line here. So we're going to have our high and then whatever our temperature is. And then we also have this line break. Okay, and then we're going to have low, our low temperature, and line break, and then weather. Now, you could do this, but hopefully you're kind of seeing that this isn't exactly the most readable way to write things out. So JavaScript actually has this cool feature called a template literal, and you can use it. A template literal is just it's backticks. So the backtick character, if you're not familiar with it, most people aren't, it should be to the left of the 1 on your keyboard, same as the tilde, but it's if you don't uppercase to get the tilde, right? You just press the key, you get the backtick. The backtick lets you use a different syntax for writing your variables into something that makes it a lot more readable. So let me show you what that looks like. So now, one, it works over multiple lines. So we no longer have to do this concatenation, and we can have this all inside one. We don't have to do all these pluses to add the different lines together. The other thing is you can directly use a variable inside of a template literal by doing this $ and then wrapping the variable name inside of braces. So that way it avoids you having to do more concatenations. And generally this just leads to a much more readable, I don't know, maybe some people really like the other way, but to me, this is a lot more readable. Now we don't need to do this. And remember, this is all just inside of a string. So let's go ahead and run that and see if that works. And there you go. Our data is printed there onto the screen. So that's pretty good. Let me stop for a minute and see, are there any questions that anyone has about anything so far? I have been taking it a little bit fast, especially if you don't know any JavaScript or HTML or anything like that. Give back the code, yes. If you want, I can actually, I don't know how small this is. I can blow this up a little bit. Does that help? Yes, okay. Do you want me to blow it up more? I can blow it up even more. I can read it pretty easily, but I imagine over Zoom, it's probably a little bit tougher to read. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. That's a good balance. So just to reiterate, let's kind of go over this function. So go over everything we've done. Here's all of our we're grabbing all of our references to our HTML elements on the screen. These are just some string constants. You can directly put these into fetch. So if you really wanted, you could type all the stuff in here, but it just leads to a really long and ugly looking line. So I usually just store it in a variable at the top, keep it out of the way. Then we have this, we set up our button. So when our button gets clicked, call this handler function or onClick or whatever you called it, whatever worked for you. And this function, the first thing it does is it grabs that value out of the text box. I guess we don't really need to log it anymore, right? Get rid of that. Then it does a fetch. So it goes to that first URL and it does a search with that input, convert it to JSON, take that data, and then we grab the very first city out of it, because remember, there could be multiple. Grab our where on earth ID. Then we do kick off another fetch with that ID to get the actual data for that location, convert it to JSON, get the actual data for that. Then we grab consolidated weather. Remember, that's the weather for the location. We grab the 0th element because we want today's. And so that's in weather data. Grab our high temperature and we convert to Fahrenheit with that helper function we wrote down here at the bottom. Same with our lower temperature. We grab that. And then weather state is just our weather state name, whatever they call that. I guess we don't really need to log it out anymore. And then our output paragraph, we set the inner HTML to be a printout of this. And these BRs, remember, those are our new lines in HTML. If you try to do /n, it's not going to have any effect. JavaScript will interpret that as a new line, but adding new lines into HTML doesn't do anything. It just, you can use it for formatting. So like, I don't really use it here, but if you add a bunch of new lines like this, you can do this for spacing reasons. Like, maybe you want to have like a line here to kind of show the different sections or something like that. You can do this. It doesn't have any effect on how it renders. It'll look the same. Okay, so we set that. That's pretty good. So we can go back, we run it. Okay, it works great. There's a few more things we can do to kind of improve this. So we need to add CSS still. Looks like we're doing pretty well on time. So yeah, we could add some CSS to make it a little more pretty, or at least get rid of this red text, which looks awful. We also could fix it round to the nearest degree, because really, I don't think anyone cares about these third or 0.947 degrees. If we rounded it, it would make a lot more sense. We could also add a notice. So if we go back to the one that I wrote, the finished one, there's of course more things you can do, but one feature of it is that you can hit enter instead of clicking the button, because a lot of times if you type it and I have to click the button, that might be a little slower. We get some different fonts, but you also get this nice loading that gives us some feedback that something happening. Currently, this API is decently fast. So like, it's not like it's super slow. Oh, let me reload the page. It's not like when you hit this and click the button, it's so slow that like you get confused, but it is kind of, it would be nice if we click the button, there was some instant feedback that, I did click the button, something's happening, don't worry. People like that kind of thing. Okay, so let's go back to the code and see if we can't implement some of these improvements here before we run out of time. Do I have any questions? Let's see. Nope, okay. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. Okay, so we have this. Why don't we start with loading? Well, first let's get rid of that red text, because that is pretty hideous. So if you go and just edit your styles, that CSS, and just delete this, that should get rid of that. Okay, much better. Even though it's not as exciting. The red text, that was just because that's what my template always has built into it, just to kind of show what you can do with CSS. The loading indicator is actually a lot easier than you might think to implement. So what we need to do is just set the inner every time you set inner HTML, it will override whatever was previously there. So what we want to do is, after we grab this input value, or it doesn't before even, it doesn't really matter the order, because they're both going to happen right next to each other. If we just set our inner HTML to loading, then because remember, all this stuff we have to wait for the network, and that's why there's kind of that, half-second wait or whatever, where you click the button, nothing seems to happen, right? That's because we're waiting on the network request to happen, which takes, a non-zero amount of time. It could take a long time, depending on how slow the server is, right? So if we set it to loading, and then as soon as the request completes and we do get to here to line 27, this will just overwrite it. So that's actually a very easy feature to implement. So now shows nothing. When we click it, we immediately get that loading, and then it will get replaced as soon as we have the data. So that's good. Oh, the enter key. So that's something that doesn't work. I wish I could do like, I don't know. I'm from Columbus in Ohio, so let's try to do Columbus. If you hit enter, right? I kind of have it. I try to hit enter to search, but it doesn't work in our application. How can we fix that? Because if you click, okay, that'll work. Oh, heavy rain. But yeah, enter doesn't work. So how can we implement that? Well, that's just another event listener. So remember, how do we handle the click? It's an event listener. Same thing for an enter. So in this case, our root object that we're going to be using is that search box, right? So that's our input. So we add event listener. But instead of click, okay, it's a little bit different because we're not clicking, right? We're hitting enter. So you need to listen for the key down event. A key down event so your function is going to get invoked. So let's do key down handler. Okay, so your key down handler or your key down event happens every time a key gets pressed. So not just enter. So that is kind of a problem. We don't want them because otherwise if they type A, it'll immediately kick off a request, which is not what we want. We want to filter and make sure that we only do it when they press enter. So the way you do that is actually whenever an event gets triggered, you get some data passed in through an argument to your function. So this function you give it in our click case, we don't really care about that data. So we don't need to pass in the argument. But for our key down, we want to know what key got pressed. And that is going to be encoded inside of an event parameter. So you just write your function taking this event. And then event.key will actually show you the key that you pressed. So it'll give you a string representation of that. So if we go log that out, you can kind of see here. Let's open up the console. And if I go into this box and type, okay, look, it showed I did 20 backspaces. If I type letters, you can see, okay, we can read all of that from JavaScript. It knows what I typed. So that's pretty cool. But we don't care about most of these things. So what we want to do is check if our event key is, well, actually, first we need to see what is enter. So if I'm here, I hit enter. Oh, it's just enter. Okay. Do an if event.key. In JavaScript, we use equals instead of 2 equals. The reason for that is if you just use 2 equals, it will do some things that it may not be what you want to do. So in most languages, if you try to say, is the string 1 equal to 1? Most languages, this is false. But in JavaScript, this is true. Because it says, oh, they're similar enough. And this might be fine for this case, but you can get in some cases where it's like more confusing or like, does null equal 0? Well, maybe. I don't know. I honestly don't know these things off the top of my head. But if you use equals, you'll get behavior that is more like other languages. So if you have different types, if you have string 1 and number 1, it won't say they're the same. So it's always good practice to use that. And if you want to use not equals, it's the same. It's just not equals. So strongly recommend you do this and don't use this one unless you're really sure that you fully understand what that actually does and you actually want the conversions and weird behavior that you get with that. So, okay, we checked if our key down was enter. And if that's true, what do we want to do? Well, it's very simple. We just want to call the handler function. The same one as that we would call with click. Because remember, this is still a proper function. We can call it like any other function we've defined, like you would in Python or C or Java, just by calling it the normal way. You don't have to only use it for event listeners. You can use them for both. So that's pretty good. So let's actually try this out. Make sure it works. Hit enter, and it works. Loading and get our data. Awesome. One thing that in this case I might do, because we only use this key down handler for this one function, we can actually do it with this anonymous arrow way that we've seen elsewhere. So we can do this, which might be the preferred way to do it, because it gets rid of some of the stuff we don't need. That makes it a little bit shorter, saves some lines. Some people like to name all of their functions. Some people do it like this. I like to make them more anonymous because I feel like it compacts things. But if you want to define functions and pass them in, like this, the way we're doing with handler, then that's totally fine too. They're both valid ways to program. Okay, great. So we've implemented that feature. What else do we want to do? Why don't we add, let's see, how much time do we have? we do have some time. Why don't we go ahead and just grab the CSS file over from this, copy it over, and I can kind of walk you through what all the different properties do. Because CSS as a language is just a mess. So honestly, if you're trying to learn CSS, I don't really have any better way of just go along, try to figure out what you want to do, and then look it up, because it's pretty hard to do different things. So let's take a look at styles.css here. So this is my CSS file for the finished project. So this right here, in order to make this background blue, if you've never seen a color represented as like this sort of hexadecimal notation, this is just a way to do RGB, because red, green, and blue, right? They make up all different colors. It's just represented as six digits in hex. So you get these letter and number looking codes. You can also use just straight colors if you just want something very simple. So we just want background to be red. And oh, this is the wrong one. Then we can do that. And you see, you just get a red background. But I found that this particular color was kind of nice. What you can do, I'm not like super designy, so what I would recommend is just look up like CSS themes or color schemes, I think is what and you can get like sets of colors that work well together. Yeah, so like I think I actually used one of these, and you get these, they kind of give you, oh yeah, this color generator, and you can pick, okay, like I want to use, I don't know, this yellow, and it creates and gives you some different colors that you can use. There's lots of different, like there's like a color picker, right? So you can kind of pick what color you want, and it will give you a bunch of different options for the shades you use. But yeah, I don't usually use a lot of CSS. I'm not very good at it, but you can do all the different colors. I just use this nice blue because I think it looks good. Okay, what else do we have in here? We have, so that's our body, right? Because that's, if you go back, so these in CSS is declarative, a lot like HTML is. If you just write, basically you write what you want to style, and then you have a set of braces, and then you set properties, and you set properties by property name, colon, value, and then semicolon to end the line. So in this case, we say we want to add things to body. So that's our entire body section. So all of our stuff is getting affected by this background color. If we only wanted to make like paragraphs like this, for example, we could, right? And then you just get that covered. And when we load this, it will also make that thing blue. But you know, why would you want to do it? In this case, it's not something we want to do, but you can do it. So, okay, we just do the whole body. Our button. Okay, so our button has a whole bunch of things going on. First, we have this font size inherit. I'll show you what that means in a minute. We have a color for that. So if you notice, the button is kind of this nice, here, let's reload, this nice other sort of darker blue that kind of accents our theme, right? So we have that. And we have border none. That's just, if we don't have that, let's see, I want to say that makes our button look a little different. So if you want to, actually that might look better. It adds kind of a border that can show it clicking, but I chose to just to remove that so that you just kind of get a more flat looking button. But it's your choice if you want to include it. Again, styling is very subjective. So different people have all kinds of different ways to do their styling. Color white, that makes their text white. Padding. So if we remove this padding, then our button will look a little different. It gives, so by default, it gives different amounts of extra space around the text. This is kind of like the minimum amount of space that you need. But if you want to manually kind of override the defaults and add your own padding, then you can. So I do, because I feel like that makes it look a little better. Text align center. If you don't do this, then it probably doesn't matter that much in this case, because the button is so small already. Yeah, it looks about the same. But theoretically, if you had a big button, then this would make sure the text is in the middle of the button, which I think is nice. And then display inline block. If we remove that, I think, oh, it doesn't actually do anything. But Okay, display inline block. So it may not, sometimes adding a CSS property doesn't have any like immediate change on the screen. But it's still good practice to do it in case things change. So display inline block will make sure that it's displayed in the same line as the thing before it. So that ensures it doesn't spill onto its own line. It's also with this text block here. It's inline, but also the block gives it some other properties. We're going to do it like a more in-depth CSS. I don't want to talk about CSS for too long here. Okay, our input box, we just do font size inherit. The reason we have these inherits is actually I have some CSS classes. So we'll get to that here. So here, our paragraph, we set our font size to 3 EM and we set our width to max out. So max content expands it to as far as it can expand. Margin left, margin right auto just means that it will center because it will automatically make each of them the same. So this, using these 3 lines, is a common way to center things. Down here, this is kind of the more interesting stuff. So these, when you put a dot in front of something, then it only applies to an element if it has the right CSS class. So the way you add a class in CSS is by, so let's add the text one, for example. So our text here, this class is intended to be for this output here. So you just do class equals text. And then to refer to that, you just use dot text, and that will make, this will work. So in this case, I only have one thing that has class equals text, but if you have lots of things that have class equals text, then it will apply this to all of them. So this will make the font size 5 EM, and it will also make it a monospace font, just because I think it looks a little different, add something to the project. And then, so what was going on with these font size inherits? Well, what that means is the element will inherit its font size from whatever its parent element is. So actually, one thing I did differently in the other project was I wrapped both of the input and the button, right? Because I want them to kind of be together. I put them inside of a div. And a div is an HTML element that doesn't actually change how things display. It's just a container to put other things in, usually so you can put a CSS class. So that way I can say, okay, this whole search bar should have a font size of 2, and then those other ones set to inherit will make sure that that inherits all the way down to both input and button. And I can center that whole chunk as one thing instead of trying to like center each one individually or something like that, which usually doesn't do what you want. And so then I can just set this to have class equals search bar. And now if we do that, now you kind of get, so actually look, it makes everything a little bigger. As a whole, it gives you a much nicer sort of feel to the application. So with a little CSS, you can do a lot of stuff to make your application look better. But again, it doesn't really affect the functionality. That's all I'm going to talk about with CSS today. If you're interested in that sort of thing, we are going to, I said this before, but we are going to do a workshop on that. So let's see, what does our application not do very well compared to the other one? If there's any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I think we're about ready to wrap up. We added all the different, okay, there is one other thing that we don't do. Oh yes, the rounding. Is it just using .2? So actually, no. JavaScript, as far as I know, does not have like a printf. Oh, it's not the right file. Does not have a printf that is like C or you might have in like Java. So basically what you use is, it's actually pretty simple. Math.round, we'll just round it to the nearest integer. That's a quick thing you can do. There's also, you can pass more arguments to math.round to like round it to like 2 digits or something. But I think just to the nearest integer is good for degrees, right? Usually people don't report fractional degrees. There we go. Oh, and you know what else we could use is, it would be nice if we had a degree symbol. If you don't have a degree symbol like on your keyboard and you don't know how to insert one, you can either look up the code for it, or I would just look up the degree symbol and copy paste it. Okay, so we can do that. All right, very nice, very nice. On Mac, it's option. We'll say, okay, yeah. I haven't actually had a Mac for that long, so I don't really know all the different shortcuts, but my editor does have a quick way to insert special characters, so it's okay. But yeah, thanks for that advice, in case there is anyone in the chat who is on a Mac. Have that. Okay, one thing we don't do is handle errors very well. So like if we put in just some gibberish, then what happens is, so when the API tries to request this, right, if we actually go to our API here, location search, right, and if we do query equals just some garbage, then it just doesn't work because it sends us back nothing because there are no, nothing corresponds to that, which is kind of a problem. And so then we just end up with this loading just stuck here forever, even though that like clearly it knows something's gone wrong, right? So uncaught city is undefined. So what problem are we running into? Well, when we get to here and we try to grab this data.0, there's nothing actually there. Does Orlando work for you? No, I actually tested that before this workshop. Unfortunately, Orlando is just not one of the cities that is supported by metaweather.com. Kind of sad. You can actually go and see like North America, and if you go into US and you go into Florida, so they have Jacksonville and Miami, but they don't have Orlando for some reason, which, oh well. But this is also probably another reason why this API is free. It doesn't cost anything. You have to be thankful for what you can get. I'm sure there's better APIs that have better coverage for all these things, but yeah, but let's say I can see that like someone might try to do Orlando, right? But it's clearly not going to work because it just isn't there. So how can we resolve this? Well, the way you handle errors inside of these .thens is at the very end, you can put a .catch. If you use Java, this works a lot like a try-catch statement, except you have to also do this anonymous function thing. So well, we could log out the error, even though we already do kind of get it logged out. But that's only because we don't see it's uncaught. That's why we're getting logged out. But if we do this, then here we go. We get it printed out. Type error, city is undefined. But we still don't fix this loading thing. So we also probably want to have something in our catch to fix up that, because that way the user knows it didn't work. So how do we do that? We just set our output.innerHTML like we had before. Something went wrong, or whatever error message you want to use. And then there you go. You get that message, and then we can decide, oh, maybe if you do something like this, right? They might be like, oh, something went wrong, and they might check their spelling. Fix that up. There you go. Oh, that reminds me. One other thing you can do is you can clear the box after each search. So whether this is something that's good or not is kind of a personal preference, and whether you think, but I think sometimes it might be nice that after they type something, it clears. That way they don't have to backspace if they want to choose some other place. So what we can do is after we read this input.value, if we just set input.value to the empty string, then it will clear it out. And then you can see it goes away, all ready to search up something else. And there you have it. That's all I have for you guys today. We got the whole app implemented. Those were all of the features that I wanted to take a look at today. Hopefully, the feedback form. Let me make sure I do that. Hold on, let me stop recording first.